The first thing to come to terms with in the acid and base chapter is what acids and bases are. What do those words even mean? And why are they so important that they keep reappearing in chemistry? So, the acidity or basicity of a liquid is how much charge is in the liquid. If a liquid has a lot of unstable positive charge in it, then the liquid is acidic. And if a liquid has, so positive charge, acidic. If a liquid has a whole bunch of unstable negative charge, then it's basic. In other words, acidity and basicity tell you about unstable charges in a liquid. Acidic solutions have a lot of positive charge. Unstable positive charge. And basic solutions have a lot of unstable negative charge. Okay, fine. That seems fair enough. Seems like a relevant thing. There are a lot of charges in molecules. Every atom has protons and electrons, things with charge, so I guess it makes sense that atoms would respond to these charges. So, why do they matter so much? They matter so much because when you put atoms into if you dunk an atom into something that has a charge like this, let's say you have like a little molecule like this. If you dunk that, you take that and you dunk it into this type of a solution, those positive charges are going to push and pull on that molecule. If that molecule has parts that are slightly positive and other parts that are slightly negative, when you put this into an acidic solution, the positive charge is going to push on the positive charge in the molecule and pull on the negative charge in the molecule. In other words, the charge in this liquid is going to squeeze this molecule, and ultimately that will change its shape so that instead of being that shape, it'll turn into some other shape. And we saw in the very first chapter how organic chemistry is the chemistry of carbon. The unique thing about carbon is that it can form all of these shapes, and it's the relationship between shapes that encodes the messages of life. Acidity and basicity, the charge in a liquid, will squeeze molecules into new shapes, and that will change the messages that they encode. Either they won't encode a message that they need to, or they'll encode a different message. So they matter. Acidity and basicity matter because they push and pull on, like those liquids are using the charge in them to push and pull on any molecules in a liquid. The positive and negative charges, I should say. So acidity and basicity matter because the positive or negative charges in them push and pull on any molecules in the liquid. That changes their shape and therefore changes how those molecules fit into the world. Okay, so acidity and basicity tell you about unstable charges in a liquid. Those liquids will use that charge to squeeze, to push and pull on any molecules in the liquid. That changes their shape, and if the molecules change their shape, then they won't fit into the same pockets. They won't have the same relationships with other molecules as they had before. The messages that they encode, that's encoded by those relationships, will change. So acidity and basicity changes the messages of any molecule inside of it. It changes all the relationships it has with the stuff around it, which is why it's so important. So humans are more sensitive to bases, a little bit more sensitive to bases. Now, we're talking about potent, extreme bases. If it's just tiny changes, for example, blood is ever so slightly basic, very, very slightly. So it's not that those slight changes, but if you have a molecule that's either a strong acid or a strong base, humans will be more sensitive to the base. And the reason for that is because to produce energy, so there are two ways you can write this. You can write it without jargon, or you could write it with some biology jargon. So one way of saying it is to produce energy, and our body stores energy in a molecule called ATP. To produce energy that way, our body, and specifically our mitochondria, the mitochondria in our cells, produce acid. They produce molecules that have this strong positive charge. So, our biology, the molecules in all of our cells, and I should say human cells. So human cells had to develop ways to cope with acidity in order to use that ATP, in order to make ATP in the way that living things do, in a way that supports human life. Since making that ATP produces acid, our biology had to develop ways to cope with that acidity. Now that's true for humans. It's not true for every creature. There are certainly microbes that can exist there are lakes on Earth that are extremely basic. If you remember, the pH scale goes from 0 to 14, where 14 is the most basic thing that could possibly be, and 7 is neutral. So acid, base, 7 is neutral. There are lakes whose pH is close to 14, and there are microbes that live in those lakes. So it's not that bases are inherently more potent. It's just that our human biology has developed in a way that has accommodated acids. So humans are more sensitive to bases in general. And the implication of that is that whenever humans, and in general animals, need to send a potent or a strong message with a small amount of a compound, they'll use bases. So for example, neurotransmitters. Like dopamine or serotonin. Those are bases. DNA is a molecule that contains very potent messages, and that's also a base. So that's an example, for example, e.g. And plants tend to make basic compounds to kill animals that prey on them. Now, the compounds that the plants make, these bases that they make, don't always kill the animal. Sometimes they just adversely affect it or change the behavior of the animal. And so, for example, caffeine is a base produced by plants that's meant to ward off animal predators. Cocaine, morphine, those are all bases produced by plants to ward off animal predators. So that's some concept of acids and bases. And just to review, here we're talking, with acids and bases, we're talking about positive and negative charge. If that doesn't seem familiar from a general chemistry class you took, let's quickly review how you'll recognize acids and bases in a molecule. Now, if someone were to ask you, what is an acid, what is a base, it's kind of a trick question because there are 3 different definitions for this. 3 different definitions. Originally, an acid was just anything that tasted sour, and that was the case from Roman times all the way until the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, when a Swedish chemist named Svante Arrhenius came up with a rigorous definition. He said, okay, water is a molecule that's everywhere, so it's a good standard. It's a good thing as a reference point. And if you break water into 2 pieces, you'll get H plus and OH minus. He noticed that solutions that have a lot of H plus tasted sour. So he said, okay, solutions that have a lot of H plus, molecules that can add H plus to a solution, those are acids. And he noticed that solutions that had a lot of OH minus, those made things taste less sour. So anything that added an OH minus, that would be a base. So those are Arrhenius acids and bases. For example, HCl, the acid in your stomach, is an Arrhenius acid because it can give away this H plus, and you'll have a Cl minus left over. NaOH, which is used in Drano, it pulls and pushes on the hair that gets clogged in your drains and dissolves it. That is an Arrhenius base because it has that OH minus that can add to solution. Now, what Arrhenius did not realize was that the crucial thing here was not the specific H and OH. What the crucial thing was the charges, the plus charge and the negative charge. So what ended up happening over time is this was a very specific definition with a very specific species. But again, the crucial thing is the charge. There are other things that have that charge. So as time went by, people found other molecules besides these making things behave in a similar way as you would expect for acids and bases. So around 30, 40 years later, 2 scientists about at the same time came up with another definition, a broader definition, so going from most specific to most broad. And this one, instead of donating specific molecules, they said, okay, an acid will be anything that donates a proton, and a base will be anything that accepts a proton. Notice that the definition for an acid actually stayed the same, because what is an H plus? A hydrogen atom has a proton in its center with an electron going around it. Take the electron away in order to get the H plus, and all you have is a proton. H plus is a proton. So these definitions are actually the same thing. Where the definition became broader is in the definition of a base. Whereas in the case of Arrhenius, it had to be OH minus that had the negative charge. In the case of Bronsted-Lowry, it's anything that has a negative charge. Anything that has a negative charge or a lone pair. Because a lone pair is a place where you have negative charge that's exposed to the world. And so that could accept a proton. And the poster child for a Bronsted-Lowry base is ammonia. If you remember, nitrogen is in group 5a, so it has 5 valence electrons. You can form bonds with these to hydrogens. So NH3, ammonia, was a Bronsted-Lowry base because it had that lone pair there. That's a place place that's negatively charged, that's exposed to the world, that could accept protons. But again, the crucial thing here was not whether something can accept hydrogens or donate hydrogens. It's the charge. And so people started finding molecules that had nothing to do with H pluses, protons, that still made liquids behave in the same way. So that this definition became too narrow and restrictive. And so finally, Lewis came up with the broadest definition. And if you ever forget this, because most people are usually more familiar with the Bronsted-Lowry definition, if you ever forget it, take each word in the Bronsted-Lowry definition and switch it to its opposite. So an acid is not something that donates, but rather it's something that accepts. And what it accepts is not a proton, but the particle with an opposite charge, electrons. And a base is not something that accepts, it's something that donates. And it doesn't donate a proton, it donates something with an opposite charge, electrons. And notice here we are where we started, positive and negative charge. What accepts electrons? Anything with a positive charge. That's an acid. What donates electrons? Anything with a negative charge. So acidity and basicity is really telling you about unstable charges in a liquid. You'll recognize them, usually in molecules. We'll be looking for H pluses that can pop off a molecule. But those charges are significant because they push and pull, they squeeze molecules in the liquid to make them change their shape. And with those changed shapes, molecules have a different meaning. They fit into the world differently, and so interact with other molecules differently. So, just for example, if you spill acid on your hand, your skin starts to dissolve if it's a strong acid. You'll just have bone left, if even. Why? What happens? The positive charge pushes and pulls on all the molecules in your skin until they come apart. And so you get a sense of the meaning and the significance of acidity in this first part of the homework. And also, hopefully, how to recognize those species.